What an audience. It's incredible to see you all here today. And I really wanted to start with that, just to thank the ad hoc group that came together to pull together this extraordinary gathering of people. It's not every day you get 40 or 50 different organisations from across the community in Northern Ireland to come together. It really is testament to the vibrant nature of so many civil society groups and faith groups. When I say civil society, I'm including the faiths in there, who've been working so hard for many, many years on a range of different issues, including all the social justice issues and environmental justice. This topic, when Juanita, I know Juanita for a long time, and she called me just before Christmas to suggest coming up, and she says, I'm thinking of the topic joining the dots, and I was like, perfect. That's exactly what we need to be doing right now. It's very close to my heart. So I'm delighted to be here and slightly humbled. I kind of feel like you don't need me here. I'll just say a few things and then I think the conversation has already started. So I'll try to just give a few kind of pointers of maybe some of my own stories, some inspiration, and then a little bit of kind of structure around how we might think about joining some dots. And it's very timely, this meeting as well. I'm sure you're very aware. There's some big political moments coming up this year, some opportunities to raise our voices, to collaborate. So it's fantastic to see such a wonderful gathering. So maybe before I get into the kind of meat of our joining the dots, I might just start by joining a few dots for you about me, and how did I come to be doing this? I'm not going to tell you a long story, but how on earth did I end up in this film with Pope Francis? Like, I had to pinch myself a few times when I even watched The Letter now, because that film, if you haven't seen it, very well worth watching. But it was an extraordinary. If you don't believe in miracles, well, if I didn't believe in miracles before, the fact that film even exists convinced me that miracles can happen, because everything worked against that film coming into existence, including pandemics, including permissions from Vatican, and not to mention having to raise a significant amount of money in order to make the film available. You'll notice The Letter is not behind a paywall. We could have put it on Netflix if we'd wanted. But most of the world's population don't watch Netflix. Most of the world's population watch YouTube. And especially younger people watch YouTube. So that's why it's free to view on YouTube for anybody in, I think, 15 different languages. We don't have it in Irish yet, which would be, if somebody wants to volunteer. My story on climate justice and joining dots started very young. I grew up in central Scotland, in the shadow of an oil refinery. So my mum's house actually looked onto Grangemouth, which is one of the world's oldest oil refineries in central Scotland, bringing oil down from the North Sea. And one of my most vivid memories that stands out from my childhood is waking up in the middle of the night with this orange glow in my bedroom, bright orange glow, and looking out the window, and everything was covered in snow. But the world wasn't white. The world was bright orange, because all the reflections from the flares of the oil refinery had lit the world up in bright orange in the middle of the night. And I think that early kind of memory, and the fact that all my neighbours worked in BP and ICI, my uncles all worked offshore in the oil industry, and even now some of my family still work offshore. it gave me a really strong sense right from the early age that we can only solve environmental issues if we start to join dots. Because everybody depended on the oil and gas. And we can't solve that, our current crisis, unless we start to tackle the causes of climate change. I did my first project on global warming when I was about 14 years old. And I won't give away my age, but that's a long time ago. And it was about the impact of the oil refinery. And I wasn't some child genius. This isn't saying that I was some kind of child genius back in the 90s I discovered global warming. It was commonly known about. And I only had to open the school books and to read about global warming being caused by fossil fuels. And even as far as doing the maths on when this would start to become a major issue for the world. And even back in the 1980s, in the publication of the Brundtland Commission, they were saying that the mid-2020s, which is where we are now, is when we would start to see the impacts of global warming. So to fast forward, my response to all of this was really to go and study economics and sustainability, and went on and did a PhD, and then ended up coming to Ireland because I felt I didn't want to stay in the academic world. I wanted to do something quite practical to change things. I was so fascinated in particular by the way that faith values, spiritual values, our common shared beliefs can shape and change our economic system. It's the only thing that really can transform a system, is the values that are at the heart of it. So I ended up coming to Trócaire. I thought I'd come for a year and test it out and see what happened. And lo and behold, I worked with Trócaire for 18 years. I settled down, got married, met somebody in Maynooth, and absolutely loved those years working with Trócaire, one of the great, I would say, Irish institutions that we have and we should treasure. It was in Trócaire that I really discovered how climate change is a reality, a real, like something that is happening in our world. Back in the 2000s, I worked in policy advocacy and campaigns, and we worked really hard to influence change within the political system and within the economic system. We did it on many different issues, from third world debt to raising the aid budget. We managed to convince the Irish government to take a lead on banning landmines back in the early 2000s. We played a role in the SDGs. And then I think most significantly, we helped the Irish government to become the first government in the world to legislate for fossil fuel divestment in its sovereign wealth fund. And at the same time, encouraged the Irish Bishops' Conference, the Church of Ireland, to make a stand and to divest their own investments from fossil fuels. During the pandemic, I changed tack and decided that I would move from Trócaire into starting a new organisation, which is this one, Faithinvest. And it's in moving to Faithinvest, I was really keen to join more dots, and some really important dots. And those dots are the dots of how we, as individuals of faith or no faith, of institutions, can use our assets and our investments to shift the dial on climate justice and environmental action. Faith communities, globally, still comprise over 80% of the world's population. Think about that. Well over 80% of people say they adhere to a religious faith. Faiths have well over $7 trillion invested in the stock markets. And faith organisations collectively own or have management control over 12% of the world's habitable surface. So faiths really matter. And it's the reason why we set up Faithinvest, to bring together different faith communities to understand their important role as stakeholders in shifting their assets into sustainability and putting their money where their mouth, or as one rabbi said to me, money where your soul is. So where are we now in terms of the climate crisis? Well, if you're here today, I probably don't need to give you the bad news. You're probably well aware of it. But I think we have to just remind ourselves that there was a report came out just this week, actually, that says that last year was the warmest year pretty much since humans walked on this planet. And we can see this with our own eyes now, the changes that are happening even here on the island of Ireland. And we know from all the scientific research that the pace of change is accelerating too. We can almost feel the tipping points that scientists have talked about for a long time happening right now. I think coming into this year more than any other, there's actually a profound sense of weariness amongst people who care about what is happening. There's a feeling in some people, at some times, that what is happening has somehow gone beyond us. It's kind of almost too big for us to do something about. And then when we think about what is happening around in terms of response at the political level, it's not a pretty picture either. I was at COP28, as was already mentioned, just before Christmas. And I think it's fair to say that in my 30 years of being a climate and environmental activist, we pretty much hit rock bottom at one point during that. And I don't say that lightly. I'm a firm believer in the UN, in multilateralism, but it beggars belief that the process that we as humanity have set up to tackle the existential crisis we face through fossil fuels and climate change was in a petrol state and was chaired by an oil company. Think about that, where we've got to. You couldn't make it up in a Hollywood film. In fact, if somebody had put that in a Hollywood film, I'm thinking of the Don't Look Up, which was in the cinema, or it was on the telly last year, people would think it was farcical. It's too far-fetched. And yet this is the reality that we're facing right now at a global level in terms of tackling the crisis. The UN process is badly in need of reform. And starting by removing the 2,500 oil and gas lobbyists who were present at the climate summit. To give you an idea, to me, putting the oil and gas industry in charge of the process to tackle climate change is like putting the tobacco industry in charge of tackling lung cancer. Of course, at COP, there were also glimmers of hope, and I'm going to get more hopeful. Don't worry, don't worry. But we have to be true to the reality we're facing. For the first time in the 28 years of this process of tackling climate change, we named the primary culprit. It took 28 years to actually say the F words. Fossil fuels. Believe it or not, fossil fuels have never been mentioned. It was the unmentionable. And yet now, at least there's a mention that it is named, and it is thanks quite largely to Mary Robinson and to the Guardian newspaper, who unearthed a scandalous encounter that she had. When I say scandalous, the scandal of the way she was talked to by the chair of the COP in an online webinar before the COP. And it threw open what he didn't want anybody to hear or know, and I think he probably thought he'd got away with it. But there you are, it appeared, and it really put the issue of fossil fuels front and centre within the COP. So we have fossil fuels mentioned. It's hard to get excited about it, I have to say, after 28 years, but it's something. The world is finally recognising that 85% of our emissions come from burning oil, gas and coal. Governments have also started to recognise the need for more finance on climate change and have started a fund for loss and damage, so directing the kinds, not yet the scale, but setting up the processes to channel large sums of money into tackling the injustice of climate change. And perhaps the most positive moment for me at the COP, there were two actually. One was the signing up of the Colombia to a fossil fuel treaty, a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty campaign. This campaign has come out of nowhere in recognition that whilst we have this UN process of the COPs, we also need a specific treaty which deals with fossil fuels. And now there are 15 countries have already signed up to initiate a UN process. And why a non-proliferation treaty? Because I think they recognise that the capacity of the fossil fuel industry, if it burns all the fossil fuels that are on the books right now, is tantamount to the kind of destruction of weapons of mass destruction. So if you use the logic. So this is gaining momentum, and this was a really positive outcome of COP. The other positive outcome was something called the Faith Pavilion. And this was a new initiative that started at COP. And it brought together people of faith from all over the world who have been acting and working on environmental issues for many decades. And it brought them into the main space of COP to start to have a dialogue together and to build the kind of, to join the dots, to know what different faiths are doing, and to recognise that if we, the 85% of the world's population who adhere to a faith, even half adhere to the environmental imperatives of caring for a sacred earth, we would change, the change would be systemic. So at the Faith Pavilion, and if you look up Faith Pavilion on YouTube, you'll find all the talks. We had talks from such a vibrant array of faiths. And one of the wonderful things that you discover is that when you start to put people of different faiths and different traditions in a room together, and you start them talking, what emerges can be something so rich and so wonderful that it brings about a change, and it can really enhance everybody's capacity and everybody's enthusiasm to address this difficult issue. In the work that I'm doing now with Faithinvest, which is multi-faith, is that despite the failures in our political processes, the work of civil society and the youth in particular, we think maybe, oh, Fridays for Future, was that just a flash in the pan, all these youth? But things are happening under the surface. And it's like a forest that's growing, kind of in silence, but it can't be silent. And that's one of the things that you might want to think about. But this forest, whether it's Laudato Si movement and Laudato Si groups popping up all over the world, not just Ireland, but all over the world, whether it's the work that the Sikhs are doing with their sacred forests, whether it's all the extraordinary work that the Brahma Kumaris community are doing all over India to put in renewable energy systems. I could go on, whether it's the Muslim Islamic world, which is waking up and has its own version now of Laudato Si called Al-Mizan, the balance, which is being rolled out across mosques right over the world. Or whether it's the Baha'i community and all the wonderful work they are doing to start to bring together different faith communities. We could go on and on. The world that we see on our TVs paints a world that's in decline and destruction and division. But there's a whole other world happening that we need to now lift up and to start to change the narrative by joining the dots together. So where do we start with that? And that's what we want to talk about really today. How do we start and where do we join dots? Well, I think the first thing for me that I feel we need to do is to face this feeling that, and I mean, maybe it's not even, if you're in the room today, you're already taking a step to feel empowered. You know, you have quite a network of people that kind of help you to feel empowered in this space. But I'm thinking about all the others, all the people we meet in our daily lives and all the people that are out there. We need to kind of face into this experience that many people have now of feeling disempowered and feeling paralysed and unable to take action. There's a real sense out there, particularly within young people, but it's certainly not only an issue for young people, of ecological or climate anxiety, grief and depression around where the world is going. It's heavy stuff. And I think that for us all, it's important to tackle that feeling of the magnitude of the challenge that we face, but not allow ourselves to get stuck there. We need to deal with this emotional response, which has a deeply spiritual resonance. In fact, it's not just the faith communities now that are talking about the spiritual nature of the crisis that we're facing. Even scientists are now talking about this, about the need, and in fact Pope Francis, for example, calls in Laudato Si for a dialogue between faith and science. And the world of faith and faith communities, and when I say faith communities, I don't mean one particular religion or another religion, it's about faiths coming together, have such an important role to play in this, in helping, I don't like the word dealing with, because it sounds like we're kind of dealing with something, but in expressing this moment that we're living in. It's the faiths that have the traditions of dealing or like helping people through grief, through suffering, the role of lamentation, of acknowledging where we're at in order for us to move into something new. We were talking yesterday about Loch Ness and about the deep kind of spiritual sense of loss that many people on the shores of Loch Ness have been experiencing, and how some of them spontaneously came together to have, they called it a wake, because they could see that the loch is dying. It's not just about having wakes for the animals, and that tolling the bell is another thing, but it's also about moving beyond that. But the moment of coming together and acknowledging that something has to change, that the direction we're going in is something so important. And I don't think the world can move forward in tackling this crisis without the input of the faith community, the faith communities in that important moment of acknowledgement and moving forward then with compassion. My own experience has been one of stepping forward from that sense of sadness. When I had my own children, I wrote a book about my experiences of climate change called Climate Generation. And it was a working through of the fact that I'd had 2 boys, and yet knowing what I know about the climate crisis, the world that I see is not the world I want for my children, and the world we want for our own children and our nephews and nieces and grandchildren. So we have to work through that grief. And community is so important in that. It's something that we cannot do on our own. We need to work together, and we need to embrace more people in working together on that. As Leonard Cohen said, there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. And in fact, if we think of our greatest heroes and our greatest kind of people who we admire throughout history, those who struggled for human rights, against apartheid, for the emancipation of women, for any great cause, what did they have in common? What they had in common was not that they lived in hopeful times, but they managed to find hope when everybody thought there was only despair. So when we think today, I think that we too need to find that hope. We need to understand where those deep wells of hope are. Hope. Greta Thunberg talks of hope. And she uses a fantastic phrase which says that hope comes when we act and only then. And this is also my own experience. And it echoes somebody I'm a great admirer of, and that's the American writer and activist Joanna Macy. And if you don't know Joanna Macy, I'd encourage you to read some of her stuff. She talks about the idea of active hope in her book, Coming Back to Life. And of course, that active hope has deep Christian roots. For those of us who have a Christian faith, the deep meaning of hope is really rooted in the idea of resurrection. Our hope is in an eternal hope, a hope that is rooted in the patterns of nature that reflect back to us the patterns of death and rebirth. So every time each of us moves out of despair into hope, we are also bearing witness to a message of resurrection in our lives. And this active witness to hope has more power than we can ever imagine. And I think that in today's world, joining dots that build hope is perhaps the most important role that we can play together. So where do we start? And this is where we're going to get over to you. How do we start to navigate where we are today and the momentous task that needs to be undertaken to tackle climate justice or climate injustice? I want to offer to you two very simple mental maps that might help. And I didn't invent them myself, but I'm going to propose them to you because they might be a spur for your conversations. The first one is 3 concentric circles, and maybe you can write them down to get active. And you've probably seen this before. So it's the circle of concern, the circle of influence, and the circle of control. So if you draw on your page in front of your piece of paper 3 circles. Whoops, the biggest one is what we would call the circle of concern. All of us have many, many concerns relating to climate change, relating to environmental justice. Some of them we don't feel we've got any agency to tackle. So you can put all your concerns into the big circle. There's a second circle in there, which is influence. And each of you here has a huge circle of influence. The fact that you could even come into this building this morning and have time in the middle of the working week to be here says you have influence, and you probably don't recognise how much influence you have. And the one in the middle is your circle of control. So you might want to think about, as we get into the conversation, each of those. How do you enlarge your circle of influence? How do you use this circle of influence in order to shift the dial on climate change and climate justice? There's very little we can do when we stay in the circle of concern, and that's where most people stay when it comes to climate change and climate justice. But what are the levers that we can use in order to influence change? And what do we have direct control over? We're all citizens. We're all consumers. We all have financial arrangements of different kinds. We have pensions, some of us. We have, if you're lucky, you've got money in the bank, you've got investments. Most people bank. Everybody has a bank. These are all choices that we need to be thinking about in order to tackle the question of climate change and climate injustice. The second mental map I wanted to share with you, and we'll come on in the discussion to look at, is something, it's a bridge. It's a bridge. Because one of the things that I've realised when it comes to working in coalitions or working in collaborative kind of settings around climate change is that there's a risk. There's lots of risks, but there's one particular risk, and that is everybody needs to be doing it this way or needs to do this thing, like particular, we all need to be outside on Fridays, for example. Everybody's like, right, is that what we're talking about? But I think that it's a risk, and especially in a group like this where there's so much diversity. And Joanna Macy has a really interesting kind of way of looking at this whole question of how do we fit into this moment of profound change in the world and tackling this great issue of ecological kind of change and just like changing the system that we need to change. And I've kind of turned it into a bridge. So if you think about it this way, there's 3 kind of main types of actions that we need to take to tackle climate change and tackle ecological issues. The one that's really rising up Well, there's two that are rising up at the moment. One is on this side, and I would call it resistance. The action of resistance is saying we're causing a lot of damage to our environment. We need to take urgent action to stop that. So you think about all the kinds of actions you could take that actually are about resistance. Some of them are about campaigning, some of them are about stopping things. You can start to use your own imagination around the idea of resistance. But resistance is not enough. Resistance is absolutely important, but it's not enough to get us where we need to go. So the other side of the bridge is, I call it the future we need. The future we need is, I guess, where we're going. The future we need is a really important job within a movement of people who are working for climate action and working for change. Because they're the ones who are building the future. Prototypes, models, ideas. And if you look around society, even the economy today, it's full of these. And you could start to articulate what are those future types of businesses, types of ideas. The circular economy, all the work that is being done in order to build up a sharing economy, a solidarity economy, agroecology. The future we need is a whole body of work that needs to be in conversation. It's part of the same whole, but it's different work that needs to be done. The bit in the middle is often the bit that we actually forget, and that's the work of transition. We can't get to this new future without some major transitions. And there's work to do there too. So if you think about this idea of a fossil fuel treaty, it's a perfect example of a transition. Because in order to change a system to this new kind of economy, you need to have these new arrangements in place. So as part of the whole process of building climate justice is also working on the area of transition. I'm going to leave you with that thought of transition, because we want to get to work to talk about how we here can start to build this much more joined up approach to climate justice. I've the sense today that we're really, a moment is building on the topic of climate justice, despite the dark times that we are living in. It's really important, as I said earlier on, to recognise that we are part of something that's much greater and can be much greater than the sum of the parts. And one of the most important tasks in this new phase that we're coming into is to learn how to build collaborations and fluid coalitions. Hope, as I said, is more than a feeling of optimism. Hope, for me, is about refusing to believe that this is how the story ends. It's about believing that we, collectively, with God's help, can start to join many, many dots and to rewrite the future, to get to that future that we need. And we can start today to do it together. Thank you.